December 3rd, 1990, Detroit Wayne County Metropolitan Airport. 8 dead, 10 seriously injured. 2 Northwest Airlines aircraft on the same runway at the same time. A switch in the control tower was set to maximum brightness. The runway lights were off. Nobody knew. One switch, 8 people dead. That switch is not the whole story, but it is where the story ends, and understanding how it ends tells you everything about how it began. Detroit Metropolitan was Northwest Airlines' biggest hub in 1990. It was also one of the most complex airports in the country to taxi through. 4 runways arranged in overlapping patterns, connected by a web of taxiways that required careful navigation even on a clear day. On December 3rd, the day was not clear. Snowfall had given way to rain, and rain had given way to a dense, freezing fog that was settling over the airport and thickening by the hour. By early afternoon, visibility was approaching a quarter of a mile, the legal minimum for commercial takeoff operations, and still dropping. Into that fog, 2 Northwest Airlines crews would attempt to operate. One was trying to take off. One was trying to taxi to the runway. Neither knew where the other was, and the systems designed to keep them apart would fail, one by one, until there was nothing left between them. This is Northwest 1482. The captain of Northwest 1482 was 52 years old on December 3rd, 1990, and almost everything about that day was new to him. He had started his flying career in 1966 with Pacific Airlines, staying with the company through its merger into Hughes Air West in 1968, and again when Hughes Air West was acquired by Republic Airlines in 1980. He had accumulated 23,000 flying hours over that career, more than 4,000 of them on the DC-9. By any measure, he was an experienced pilot. But in February of 1984, he had been found medically unfit due to kidney stones. What followed was 6.5 years of disability pay, medical treatment, and personal bankruptcy. And during those years, Aviation had continued without him. His type rating had lapsed. The airline he worked for had been acquired by Northwest. The procedures, the culture, the people, all of it had changed while he was away. When the FAA finally cleared him to fly again, he completed the DC-9 initial training course from scratch, plus 23 hours of supervised operating experience. He passed his check ride on November 30th, 1990, 3 days before this flight. December 3rd was his first unsupervised flight since his return. He arrived early, paid a courtesy visit to the Northwest chief pilot, and spent time reviewing the paperwork for the Pittsburgh departure. He had not eaten since the previous evening. The first officer was 43 years old, recently retired from the U.S. Air Force after a 20-year career flying B-52s and T-38 trainers. He had been hired by Northwest in May of 1990 and had accumulated 4,685 total hours, of which 185 were on the DC-9. Because he had been with the airline less than a year, he was still on probation. Every captain he flew with would submit a performance evaluation. He was, by several accounts, an assertive personality with more recent command experience than the captain he was flying with that day. On the jet bridge outside, 40 passengers were boarding for the short afternoon hop to Pittsburgh. A woman in a window seat tucked her bag under the seat in front of her. A man in the aisle read through a magazine without looking up as the cabin doors were pulled closed. The forward flight attendant ran through her count. 40 passengers, 4 crew, 44 souls on board. Everything was on schedule, or close enough. The crew had time to sit and talk while the last passengers settled in. During that conversation, the first officer mentioned that he was familiar with operations at Detroit Airport. The captain, flying his airline's largest hub for the first time since his return, heard that as reassurance. He took it to mean the first officer knew the layout. What the first officer actually meant was that he was familiar with the radio procedures and pushback protocols. Neither man clarified the distinction. The captain did not brief the taxi route. Before they pushed back, the first officer told the captain a story about his military service. He had been shot down over Southeast Asia, he said. He had ejected twice, once in combat, once during an engine fire on takeoff in the T-38 trainer. He described both incidents in detail, animated and specific, while the captain nodded along and said, "Wow, is that right?" His military records would later show no accidents, no incidents, no ejections. He had retired as a major, not a lieutenant colonel as he claimed. Every detail of the combat biography was fabricated. The captain believed him, and that belief, planted in the cockpit before the aircraft moved, would shape everything that followed. To understand why the next hour unfolded the way it did, you need to know something about how authority works in a commercial cockpit. Researchers call it the authority gradient, the difference between the perceived command authority of the captain and the first officer. If the gradient is too steep, the first officer says nothing when the captain is wrong. If it is too flat, no one is clearly in charge. But there is a third failure mode, rarer and more dangerous. The gradient inverts. The first officer's presence becomes dominant, and the captain, without realizing it, stops trusting his own judgment and starts deferring to the man in the right seat instead. That inversion is precisely what those fabricated stories had produced. The captain was about to fly his first unsupervised route after 6 years away. The man beside him appeared to be a decorated combat veteran with recent command experience. By the time the pushback tug connected to the nose wheel, the authority in the cockpit had already quietly shifted. Northwest Airlines, in December of 1990, had no crew resource management training program, no shared framework for naming what was happening, no protocol for either pilot to recognize or correct it. CRM had been a formal discipline since the late 1970s, developed specifically in response to crashes where experienced crews had made fatal errors, not because they lacked skill, but because they had no language for managing authority and doubt under pressure. Northwest had been one of the early participants in that research. They helped shape the framework. They were, by 1990, one of the last major U.S. carriers to implement it. There was no shared language in that cockpit for what had already begun. By 1:35 p.m., all 40 passengers had boarded. The ground controller cleared them for pushback, and the crew started both engines. As they rolled back from the terminal, the first officer looked out through the fog and said, "Look at the viz out there now." The captain did not respond. The ground controller cleared them to taxi to runway 03 center via the inner taxiway, exiting the apron at Oscar 6. What followed was a sequence of navigational errors that unfolded slowly, in small steps, each one invisible from the outside, each one compounding the last. The inner taxiway was the road that ran along the edge of the terminal apron, a concrete ring that connected the gates to the network of taxiways beyond. Oscar 6 was a connector, a short strip of pavement that led outward from the inner taxiway, across the outer taxiway, and across runway 0927, a cross runway that cut through the middle of the airport. On the far side of that crossing, a continuation led to taxiway Foxtrot, then taxiway X-ray, and finally to the threshold of runway 03 center. The route was manageable and good visibility with a thorough briefing. In near zero fog with no briefing, it was something else entirely. The centerline markings on the inner taxiway near the Oscar 6 intersection were severely faded and nearly invisible in the conditions that now existed. The crew could not find them. The first officer told the captain to navigate by landmarks instead. They missed the Oscar 6 turnoff completely, drifting instead onto the outer taxiway, a parallel road that ran between the inner taxiway and the runways, and which the crew had no clearance to use. In the tower, the ground controller asked Flight 1482 for their position. The first officer reported that they were eastbound on Oscar 6. Oscar 6 runs northwest to southwest. You cannot be eastbound on it. The controller did not catch the impossibility. He told them to report crossing runway 0927 and moved on. The first officer, now aware that something was wrong, but unwilling to admit to being lost, his performance evaluation was pending, and the captain had delegated navigation to him, told the captain they were probably on Foxtrot. They were not on Foxtrot. Foxtrot was on the far side of runway 0927, which they had not yet crossed. Neither pilot checked the airport chart. The fog outside the windows had reduced the world to a cone of gray, maybe 30 feet in any direction. The captain was taxiing by feel, by the sound of the engines, the faint pressure of the nose wheel tracking across pavement, the occasional glimpse of a taxiway light appearing and vanishing in the murk. Under those conditions, the airport chart in the cockpit was the only reliable picture of where they were. Neither pilot opened it. They were now approaching the most dangerous intersection on the airport. To understand what that means, consider the layout. The outer taxiway, the one Flight 1482 was now traveling on, ran in a rough arc between the inner taxiway and the runways. Along that arc, a series of connector taxiways radiated outward like spokes. Most of them led to runway crossings, but at one point, the intersection of Oscar 4, X-ray, and Victor, 5 taxiways and 2 runways met in a configuration so confusing that the NTSB, when it later taxied an aircraft through the same junction in daylight with good visibility, could not agree among its own investigators which taxiway was which. Taxiway X-ray led directly across runway 0927. Taxiway Victor led directly onto runway 03 center, the active departure runway. Oscar 4's outer segment led into the intersection of both runways simultaneously. 3 of the 5 exits put you on an active runway. None of them were clearly labeled to distinguish one from another. The signage at the junction showed only that both X-ray and Oscar 4 connected to runway 0927. Oscar 4's connection to runway 03 center was not marked anywhere. Northwest 1482 was approaching that intersection in near-zero fog, with a crew that did not know where they were, guided by a first officer constructing a plausible-sounding position narrative and hoping it would resolve itself before the captain noticed. The ground controller, now aware that 1482 was on the outer taxiway, issued a new instruction. Continue to Oscar 4, then turn right onto X-ray. The instruction sounded simple. The intersection made it anything but. By the time the aircraft was in position to turn onto X-ray, the X-ray sign had already passed behind them. Oscar 4 and X-ray looked identical from where they sat. Both signed as leading to runway 0927. Oscar 4's connection to runway 03 center unmarked. The captain taxied up to what he thought was the Oscar 4 centerline. X-ray was behind them. The only remaining right turn led directly into the intersection of both active runways. The first officer felt a flicker of doubt, started to say, "Well, wait a minute," then overrode it. They needed to be on X-ray. This felt like X-ray, therefore it was X-ray. He told the captain to proceed. Northwest 1482 rolled slowly onto the intersection of runway 0927 and runway 03 center. The intersection was wide enough that from the cockpit of a DC-9, with visibility measured in feet rather than yards, there was no sense of having entered something that shouldn't be entered. No edge, no boundary, just pavement continuing forward into gray. The captain saw a single edge light through the fog and asked, "This is the active runway here, isn't it?" The first officer told him no. This was 0927, the inactive crossing runway. They were clear to proceed. They crept forward. On the far side, where taxiway X-ray should have continued, there was only grass. The captain stopped the aircraft, set the parking brake, said, "Tell them we can't see nothing out here." The first officer called the controller and reported that they were at the intersection of X-ray and runway 0927, holding short. They were not holding short. They were in the middle of runway 03 center, stopped, engines at idle, invisible in the fog from every vantage point on the airport surface. Northwest 299, a Boeing 727 with 154 people on board, had just been cleared for takeoff. 1:44 p.m. The DC-9 is stopped on the active runway. The captain is trying to reach air traffic control. His first 2 attempts go out on the wrong frequency, no response. On the runway behind them, Northwest 299 is completing its before takeoff checklist. The 727's captain, with 10,400 hours, had pushed back an hour and 21 minutes late. He listened to the automated weather broadcast twice. The second broadcast reported visibility at 1/4 of a mile, exactly the company minimum for departure. His first officer observed, aloud, that the actual visibility looked to be less than a 1/4 mile. The 727 captain agreed. They began the takeoff anyway, reasoning that as long as ATC was reporting the minimum, they were legal to go. What neither crew knew was that an off-duty controller, preparing to come on shift, had taken a visibility measurement using the airport landmark chart. She determined the actual visibility was 1/8 of a mile, half the reported minimum, below the threshold that would have grounded both aircraft. She walked to the tower controller and asked if he wanted to update the report. He said no. Northwest 299 was cleared for takeoff at 1:44 p.m. The crew finished their final checklist items and began the roll 48 seconds after receiving clearance. At 1:44 and 59 seconds, the first officer said, "Boy, this is dog now." The captain advanced the thrust levers. On the DC-9, the captain has finally reached the correct frequency. He transmits, "We're not sure. It's so foggy here and we're completely stuck." The ground controller asks if they are on a runway or a taxiway. The captain says they are on a runway by Oscar 4. The controller asks them to confirm they are clear of runway 03 center. The first officer understands. "We're on runway 21 center," he says. The captain broadcasts, "I believe we are. We're not sure." The ground controller has confirmation. A lost aircraft on the active runway. He spends 27 seconds attempting to verify their precise position before announcing to the tower cab that there may be a runway incursion. The tower supervisor, who has been managing paperwork, hears it and shouts, "Stop all traffic." The tower controller hears the call. He checks his radar display. Northwest 299 is not on it. It has been over a minute since the takeoff clearance, and he concludes they must already be airborne. He does not transmit the stop instruction to the 727. Northwest 299 is not airborne. It is accelerating through 100 knots, 640 meters from the stopped DC-9, in fog so dense that neither crew can see the other. 1:45 p.m. and 39 seconds. The pilots of the 727 see the DC-9 emerge from the fog directly ahead. The 727 captain wrenches the controls left. Too late. The right wingtip strikes the DC-9's windscreen. It tears down the entire length of the fuselage, a blade drawn along the passenger cabin from front to rear. 3 passengers and right side window seats are killed instantly. The wing continues rearward, strikes the DC-9's rear-mounted right engine, tears it from the airframe. The outboard 4 meters of the 727's right wing come away with it. The 727 disappears back into the fog. The DC-9 is on fire. The captain cuts the fuel and shouts for evacuation. In the forward cabin, passengers reach the L1 door before the flight attendant, thrown to the floor in the impact, and attempt to open it themselves. Untrained in the mechanism, they cannot open it fully. The slide does not deploy. Passengers jump unaided to the ground. At the rear of the aircraft, burst fuel lines spray fuel across the tail section. It ignites. All right side exits are destroyed or blocked by fire. One left overwing exit is forced open, allowing a portion of passengers to escape. The rear flight attendant and a male passenger go for the tail cone exit, a design feature unique to the DC-9, in which the entire rear cone of the fuselage can be jettisoned to create an emergency escape route. The handle is pulled. The cone does not move. The cables connecting the handle to the latches had been misrigged during a maintenance inspection at Northwest's Atlanta facility months earlier. Too much slack had been left in the cable run. The latch could not be actuated from inside the aircraft. In their desperation, one of them pulled the handle with enough force that the shaft snapped in two. Both of them died in the tail cone from smoke inhalation. 3 more passengers died inside the cabin, unable to reach any exit through the debris and smoke. 8 dead, 10 seriously injured, 26 with minor injuries. The DC-9 was completely destroyed. The 727 came to a stop 640 meters beyond the collision point. All 154 people on board were uninjured. The aircraft was eventually repaired and returned to service, where it remained until retirement in 2007. That night, and in the days that followed, investigators began assembling a picture that went well beyond 2 crews and 1 foggy afternoon. The NTSB found the primary cause to be poor crew coordination, the captain's failure to exercise command authority, and the first officer's overconfidence in his own navigational ability. The authority gradient had inverted so completely that a captain with 23,000 hours had deferred, again and again, to a first officer who was navigating by confidence and hoping it would resolve before anyone noticed. What investigators found beneath that surface was more troubling. The first officer's fabricated military biography became part of the formal record. His service documentation showed no ejections, no combat incidents, no rank of lieutenant colonel. He had been an ordinary major who flew B-52s and T-38s and retired without incident. Every story he told in that cockpit had been invented, and delivered with enough specificity and conviction that a captain already uncertain about his return had accepted it as the measure of the man beside him. The investigation identified this as a direct contributing factor to the authority inversion that preceded everything else. He had told those stories, the evidence suggested, to impress a captain who he knew would be evaluating him. He had instead produced a dynamic that cost 8 people their lives. The contributing factors extended beyond the cockpit in every direction. The ground controller had missed the impossibility of the first officer's eastbound on Oscar 6 position report, a basic geographic error that should have flagged the crew as disoriented. He had issued directions through a junction the NTSB itself had found impossible to navigate without confusion. The tower supervisor had been handling paperwork during the worst visibility of her career at Detroit. The visibility had been reported at twice its actual value, and the correction had been declined. And the centerline lights on runway 03 center, lights that would have told any crew entering that runway that it was active, had been off. Here is the part that the switch revealed. The tower controller believed those lights were burning at maximum brightness. He had set the control to maximum. The switch in the tower, poorly designed, gave no indication of the actual state of the circuit it controlled. The lights were off. The airport chart did not acknowledge that centerline lights existed on that runway at all. The pilots who entered it had no reason to expect them. The controller had no reason to check. The runway had appeared, in every signal available to the DC-9 crew, to be the inactive crossing runway they believed it to be, because every cue that would have told them otherwise was either broken, absent, or unknown to anyone in the system. The misrigged tail cone cables told a separate story. The maintenance facility in Atlanta that had serviced that exit had, investigators found, serious organizational and training problems. The mechanic involved had not been adequately trained. The post-maintenance inspection had not included a functional test. The DC-9 had flown with an inoperable emergency exit, and no one had known. Among those who died were the 3 passengers in right side window seats, killed on impact, the rear flight attendant, and the male passenger who could not open the tail cone exit, and 3 more who could not navigate the debris-filled aisle before the smoke overcame them. They had boarded a routine early afternoon flight to Pittsburgh. The departure had been running well over an hour late. Some of them had been waiting at the gate since before noon. The 727 that had hit them was repaired and returned to service. The passengers on that aircraft walked off the runway that afternoon with luggage intact and stories they would tell for the rest of their lives. On the DC-9, the luggage of 8 people sat unclaimed in the baggage system for days before the airline located next of kin. Both pilots lost their jobs. The first officer's fabricated biography remained in the record. The investigation did not fully explain why he had invented it, only that he had, systematically, and that the captain had believed him, and that in the absence of any training program that might have named what was happening in that cockpit, neither of them had the language to correct it. Northwest Airlines introduced a crew resource management program shortly after the accident. They had been positioned to introduce it years earlier. The runway's centerline light switch was redesigned. The intersection at Oscar 4 was closed and eventually removed. Detroit Airport repainted its taxiway centerline markings with reflective paint, installed additional runway edge lighting, and created a program to identify and correct faded or misleading signage before it contributed to another accident. The FAA issued an airworthiness directive requiring regular functional inspection of the DC-9 tail cone exit and instructed McDonnell Douglas to redesign the handle mechanism. These changes addressed what had failed. They are the kind of changes the industry is good at: specific, traceable, documentable. A switch is redesigned. A taxiway is closed. A training program is launched. The failure is named, and then it is fixed. What is harder to fix is the accumulation of small tolerances, the individually defensible decisions that together produce a runway collision on a December afternoon. The controller who did not update the visibility report because his own estimate agreed with the current one. The supervisor who was managing paperwork because nothing had been called to her attention. The captain who let the navigation go because the man in the right seat seemed to know what he was doing. The first officer who kept navigating by confidence because admitting he was lost would have cost him something on his evaluation. None of those people made a decision that felt catastrophic in the moment it was made. They made decisions that felt reasonable, given what they knew and what they were under pressure to do. The evaluation system, the supervision structure, the weather reporting protocol, the CRM vacuum, these were the environment in which those decisions were made. They were not individual failures dressed in institutional clothing. They were institutional failures dressed as individual ones. The runway centerline lights on runway 03 center were off because a switch, designed without a reliable status indicator, installed without documentation, gave no feedback to the person operating it. The controller believed they were on. The airport chart did not record they existed. The crew had no reason to look for them, and no way to know they were absent. The DC-9 had taxied past the hold line, past the edge lights, past every marker that should have told the crew they were entering an active runway, and none of those markers had been there. The runway had looked like a taxiway because everything that made it a runway was either broken, off, or invisible in the fog. One switch, 8 people dead. The switch was redesigned, and the industry moved forward, carrying the lesson in its procedures the way it always does, after the fact, at the cost of the people who paid for it first.